Good morning. Thank you all so much for joining us here today. We have a litany of law enforcement officials who have joined us here this morning. We have Sheriff Steve Tompkins, Suffolk County. We have Peter Katusian, Sheriff of Middlesex County. We have Chief Robert Ferrolo of the Woburn Police Department. We have Chief Michael Lawn of the Watertown Police Department, Chief Roy Vasquez of the Lawrence Police Department. We have Deputy Superintendent Pauline Wells from the Cambridge Police Department. We have Fred Ryan, the Arlington Police Chief, Robert Bongiorno, the Bedford Police Chief. We have people who have dedicated their lives to law enforcement, and we very much appreciate all of their presence here today. I am also grateful to have John Rosenthal, the co-founder of Stop Handgun Violence, one of the chief advocates of Massachusetts gun safety laws, as well as Michael Kozu of Project Right, and Angus McQuilkin of the Massachusetts Coalition to Prevent Gun Violence. We also have leaders here from Moms Demand Action, the leaders of the effort to make sure that guns stay out of the hands of those who should not have them in communities all across the state. And I am also pleased to be here with the greatest mayor in the United States, Marty Walsh. Everyone in Massachusetts should be proud that we already have the strongest and most potent gun safety laws in the United States. It is in part due to these laws that we have the lowest gun death rate of all 50 states. But we know that there are still too many of our residents who are victims of gun violence. We have much more to do. We need to stop the flow of illegal firearms into our state. We need to fight the NRA-backed effort to impose any state's concealed carry rules on every other state, so-called concealed carry reciprocity. What we don't need are President Trump's misguided proposals to help arm teachers in our schools or a new federal commission headed by Education Secretary Betsy DeVos. On Saturday, President Trump said that federal commissions are not the way to address the drug crisis. But somehow, a new commission is apparently appropriate to address gun violence. We don't need another commission. We need a commitment to put the strongest gun safety rules on the books. We need laws like that, which we have here in Massachusetts. If President Trump really cared about making our schools safe from gun violence and addressing the issue of mental health in our country, he would stop trying to gut Medicaid, the single largest payer of mental health services in the United States. So, absent any leadership from the White House, the scourge of gun violence across the country, especially mass shootings, continues unabated. Each year, we lose 33,000 lives from gun violence, but we should not have to accept this. Gun violence is not inevitable or preordained. It is preventable. Former Supreme Court Justice Louis Brandeis once said that each of the 50 states has the power to be a laboratory for developing new programs and policies. Well, right now, Massachusetts serves in that role for the other 49 states when it comes to gun safety legislation. Thanks to our state legislature, as well as the individuals up here with me today, our gun safety bills are a model for other states, and I believe for the United States Congress to follow. Over the past 2 decades, Massachusetts has adopted some of the most comprehensive and effective gun violence prevention laws in the country. And as a result, since 1994, we have reduced gun deaths in the Commonwealth by 40%. And amongst the most effective of our laws are the firearms licensing requirements. In Massachusetts, anyone who wishes to purchase or own a gun must first apply for a license. To obtain this license, prospective gun owners must apply and interview in person with their local chief of police or an authorized designee. Police chiefs also have tools to revoke or suspend a license if they find that someone should not be allowed to continue to hold a license. The involvement of police chiefs in the licensing process is key. We can't overstate that enough. Police chiefs know the residents of their communities. They know how many times police officers have been called to a home. They know who has exhibited behavior that suggests a risk to public safety. And they have the direct responsibility and the vested interest in making sure that those who should not be allowed to own a gun do not get their hands on a dangerous weapon. A license in Massachusetts is only given with the police chief stamp of approval. That's the way it is in Massachusetts. That's the way it should be across the United States. This licensing framework has proven to be both durable and effective. There are fewer deaths from gun violence in Massachusetts than in any other state in the United States. And the fact that we have tough but sensible laws like those that involve our police chief is no coincidence. While we are proud of this success here in Massachusetts, we see the senseless tragedies of this epidemic of gun violence continue to tear communities apart. So tomorrow, I will introduce a bill to incentivize other states to adopt firearms licensing requirements like those that we have here in the state of Massachusetts. This bill, the Making America Safe and Secure Act, or the MASS Act, will authorize the Department of Justice to make grants totaling $20 million in each of the next 5 fiscal years to states that implement and maintain comprehensive licensing standards for gun owners and dealers. In order to be eligible for these federal funds, states must adopt standards like those we have here in Massachusetts, including giving law enforcement officials the authority to deny, suspend, or revoke a license. But this is just the kind of effective common sense gun legislation that the National Rifle Association says goes too far. Now the NRA says it represents gun owners, but we all know the truth. The NRA represents gun manufacturers. The NRA is the front group for the gun makers who care only about profits, not about the people killed by the products they peddle. For years, the NRA has been pushing a big lie. They say any limit on gun purchases or ownership, no matter how reasonable, is an assault on the Second Amendment. But the police chiefs up here today and all across Massachusetts aren't limiting anyone. They are protecting everyone. That's their job in their community. The NRA says gun safety is an attack on American freedom. But what about freedom of a student to be safe in her classroom, or a moviegoer to be safe in a theater, or a parishioner to be safe in his church? That is why we need strong gun safety legislation, and Massachusetts has the most life-saving laws on the books. On issues from democratic independence to today, Massachusetts has been the leader in making sure that we set the course for the rest of the country. This is one more of those issues. So what I'd like to do now is to introduce the great mayor of this very safe urban city, the great mayor of the city of Boston, Marty Walsh.
Thank you very much. I want to first of all thank Senator Markey for his work around the violence that we're seeing across America. As he referenced earlier about violence throughout the country, we see a mass murder every single day in America if you total the amount of lives that are lost. I applaud him in his work. I applaud him in pushing Congress forward. I applaud him on introducing the MASS Act. Certainly that bill will help. It will help to keep guns out of the hands of people that shouldn't have them. And now more than ever, we need leaders who will stand up for what is right for our country's future. So I want to thank you, Senator, I think I called you Congressman, Senator Markey, for your great work. It's an honor to me to be here with so many chiefs and representatives from law enforcement from throughout Massachusetts. I want to thank Reverend Jeffrey Brown, who just came in with us, who is no stranger to dealing with the aftermath of gun violence in our city and our Commonwealth. Reverend Brown, at his church, we have peace walks. Commissioner Evans and myself do peace walks on Friday nights. They'll be starting in a couple of weeks, and I want to thank Reverend Brown for being here. I want to thank the other elected officials that are here, Sheriff Tompkins and Sheriff Katusian, two friends for the great work they do as well in what they do in their institutions, but also working to prevent crimes from happening. John Rosenthal and all the advocates, Moms Demand Action. I want to thank you for your leadership as well. And the other day I was at an event and Moms Demand Action was there, and I was informed that they have 5 million people in their association, which is more than NRA has. And I want to commend them for the great work that they do in promoting anti-gun violence and anti-guns around the Commonwealth and around the country. So thank you for that. And lastly, I just want to thank, I have to give a shout out because he's mine, Commissioner Evans and Chief Willie Gross for hosting us today, but also for the great work that you do every single day, the men and women of the Boston Police Department. Congress needs to understand the severity of this issue, not the day after a shooting happens, but the month after it happens. How many more mass shootings in schools do we need to have to move this needle forward? We're proud of the students at Parkland for taking a stand. We're proud of the students here in Boston for taking a stand and throughout the Commonwealth. It had a profound effect on our students here in Boston. Now it's time to take advantage of, my notes say momentum, but take advantage of this sensitive time in our country and demand real positive change nationwide. Senator Markey proposes common sense gun legislation. It incentivizes police departments to use reasonable criteria for licensed gun owners, including the use of a comprehensive background check. It maps out other cities and towns to follow Massachusetts' example of safe, sensible gun policies. But of course, one shooting is one too many shootings. Young people in our neighborhoods across our city face this violence every single day. The Boston Police Department is working hard every day to get guns off our streets. They've been working with responsible gun owners to help prevent gun loss, gun theft, and trace illegal guns, the trail of them. Commissioner Evans is going to talk more about that shortly. We're also working here in Boston regionally to halt the flow of guns. Anyone who says that cities and towns are too divided to find common ground on gun policy is clearly mistaken. We can work together, and we are working together. We've held 4 regional gun summits so far, engaged 86 cities and towns all across the 6 New England states. We're sharing strategies and building relationships. We're partnering with researchers and safety advocates like Every Town for Gun Safety and Armed with Ethics. We're engaging responsible gun owners. We're bridging divides between different cultures and views we have seen across towns, cities, and even state lines. If we can do that, the federal government can do that as well. Like I said, it's time to act now. Far too often, during these days following a gun-related tragedy, the conversations begin to quiet down. Our country moves on to the next story of the day. We forget. But we can't let this happen any longer. Protecting our people and our communities must be our #1 priority. Our government must value human lives more than it values guns. The President is still talking about arming schools. Keeping our schools safe means keeping guns out of our schools. No community, no family, no child should ever have to fear for their lives or go through this pain. So again, I want to thank the Senator for bringing this message to Washington. I want to thank the Boston Police Department for working every day to keep our kids and our city safe. And I hope Congress will look at Boston and Massachusetts as an example of how to move forward and stop the violence.
Mayor. Now we're going to hear from our great commissioner, Billy Evans.
Thank you, Senator, and thank you, Mayor, for highlighting the need to have universal gun legislation. I think, as the Mayor and the Senator pointed out, Massachusetts has the lowest gun deaths of any state, and that happens because of local control and our policies in this state. You know, as commissioner of the licensing unit, we closely scrutinize everyone who comes into this particular building if they want a firearm license. You know, nobody will get a license if they've been convicted of a felony, if they've been involved in domestic violence, or if they've been institutionalized for mental illness. You know, those are the things we clearly watch for. We also make sure they're engaged in qualifying at the range, they live fire, and under certain restrictions they can't carry a gun, such as in the schools. But more importantly, if they want to carry concealed, they have to give us a legitimate reason why they're carrying. And that's what bothers me about this reciprocity issue that is being highlighted in Washington. To think that other states who have no licensing their residents will be able to come to Boston and carry, that's something we have to strongly oppose, because then we'll have more of a gun issue here. So I want to thank the Senator for representing us in Washington on that issue. Clearly, we get too many guns into the city of Boston because of lax laws outside of our Commonwealth. Back in 2013, we did a gun study, and it showed basically that of the 3,200 guns we carried, we recovered in those 6 years, 85% of those guns weren't from the first legitimate owner. 64% of them were people arrested for illegal possession. Only 32% of those guns actually were bought from Massachusetts. What we found was 25 of them, 25% came from the I-95 corridor. And when I say that, I mean North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, Virginia. 25% of our guns came that way, and 20% of our guns came from Maine and New Hampshire. So you see, although we have strong laws here, we continually have a new flow of guns coming into the city. You know, I think we do a great job. I want to commend my fellow chiefs here in Massachusetts, our partners, Jeff Brown, John Rosenthal, the mothers here. We do all we can do. Last year, we took 754 guns off the streets of the city. 494 of them were crime guns. This year, we're only 2.5 months along. We've already taken 130 guns off the street, and 80 of those were crime guns. You know, last Friday, we locked up 2 17-year-olds in our city for murder. A week earlier, 2 18-year-olds for murder, all for a homicide with a gun on Kenwood Street. So we lost 5 young kids to violence that day because 4 of them are incarcerated and 1 17-year-old lost his life. That's the damage that one gun can do in our city. You know, I'll always look back when me and the mayor first came into office, when a 9-year-old was shot by his 14-year-old brother playing with guns. That's the stuff that bothers us. And I think if more people had to see what we see in the city, the mayor go into these parents' houses, I think they'll have a better understanding of why we're tough on violence. You know, we started a program, the mayor, myself, where we send letters to all the registered gun owners in the city of Boston, asking them if they lose their gun, if they transfer their gun, or their gun is lost, that they have to go online and make that notation. In that letter, we also asked them, basically, if they didn't want their gun, we'd buy it back for $100. We're working with all the physicians in this area to keep that program going. And we also provide gun locks. And we're working through the Mayor's Gun Summit to make sure all the New England states adopt those policies. So, you know, we can have all the toughest laws in the world here in Massachusetts, but, you know, when you can go across the state line and basically purchase them without a license or a permit, it does no good. So I want to commend Senator Markey for what he's doing. Mayor Walsh, from day one when he took office, our main priority has been stopping the violence in this city. 1 death is way too many, and we'll continue to work every day to keep this city safe. But our number one priority, and I can tell you every day, is to get the guns off the street. I don't know how many press conferences I've been at homicide scenes where I constantly say there's way too many guns on the street. So what we're proposing here is great. I just hope that we have some luck in Washington, because honestly, they don't seem to be getting the message. After what happened in Parkland, what's happened across the country, I don't know what's going to take, but now's the time. I commend everybody. I'm looking forward to the student march on March 24th, because obviously they don't listen to adults in Washington. They got to hopefully they'll listen to the students. So thank you all. Appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Commissioner, and you do a fantastic job with your partner, Superintendent and Chief William Gross here in the city. Just an absolutely incredible team making this city so safe. Now I'd like to introduce the Sheriff of Suffolk County, Steve Tompkins.
Good morning. Before I give my remarks, I would like to also echo the thanks to Mayor Walsh, to Commissioner Evans, to all of the law enforcement personnel standing behind us, to Reverend Brown, to John Rosenthal, to Peter Katusian, the president of the Massachusetts Sheriff's Association, and to the social service agencies that really lift up the banner every day for what needs to get done here. And finally, I want to say thank you to Senator Markey. Over his long, storied career, he has proven that he can get the work done. And at this time, we really do need a champion down in Washington to carry this issue forward and to really get the changes that we need so that we really do protect our kids, our families, and our communities. As the Sheriff of Suffolk County, I remain committed to stemming the tide of gun violence and gun-related deaths in our cities and neighborhoods. And while I'm a supporter of Second Amendment rights, I also believe that we have not done enough to keep our children and our communities safe from the dangers of firearms. The provisions laid out in the MASS Act are all of the common sense, no-brainer variety that should be acceptable to even the most ardent protectors of the Second Amendment. We already know that more than 90% of voters and 90% of gun owners support background checks. And 72% of NRA members also support background checks. Further, at least 90% of voters and more than 90% of gun owners support laws to prevent people with mental illnesses from buying a gun. Clearly, there is no single solution to ending gun-related violence. Instead, it will require a multi-pronged, collaborative effort, including research and technological innovation, enhanced community engagement, responsive law enforcement, and responsible logical limits on the ownership of military-grade firearms. And while some may argue otherwise, improving gun safety is certainly not antithetical to our constitutional rights. Instead, it's an effort that rests on our country's greatest strengths, which is courage, innovation, and concern for our fellow citizens. Consider this. Statistically, during the time that I've been at this podium, someone in this country was shot to death. In fact, 90 Americans will be killed by guns in the next 24 hours. Unfortunately, in the next 12 months, thousands of Americans may well lose their lives as a result of gun use. We as a society can no longer be comfortable with this degree of bloodshed and tragedy. So let's be brave, let's be smart, and let's work together to make gun safety a priority. Our families' lives and our communities depend on it. Thank you so much.
Excellent. Thank you, Sheriff. Thank you, Sheriff. Next, we're going to hear from Middlesex County Sheriff Peter Katusian.
Well, first, let me thank Senator Markey. I find it fascinating that a piece of legislation that has worked so well in one state has never really been considered to be applied on a national level. And once again, as Ed Markey has had this long and storied career and so many years in Congress, and he gets elected to the United States Senate, and you would think many would say, I'm going to ride my time out. I'm going to ease off into the rest of my career I'm going to relax a little bit. He has redoubled his efforts because he knows that he has this opportunity to protect our communities and to save lives. I want to say thank you to the law enforcement that's with me, Commissioner Evans, Chief Gross, all the other law enforcement. I'd like to especially thank Deputy Superintendent Pauline Wells from Cambridge Police, Chief Mike Lawn from Watertown Police Department, Chief Bob Bongiorno from Bedford Police Department, and Chief Fred Ryan from Arlington Police Department. All great leaders that know their communities, 5 years ago, I stood alongside Senator Markey following the shooting at Sandy Hook. And here we are 5 years later, saying the same things, calling for federal action to address gun violence, including closing the gun show loophole. Sadly, even in the wake of that horrible tragedy, Congress failed to act once again. And the results of that inaction have been devastating. Behind the talking points and partisan rhetoric, there are people whose lives have been forever changed by gun violence. In fact, the Washington Post did an analysis suggesting that 150,000 people experienced an on-campus shooting in some way since Columbine in 1999. 2 decades ago, as a former prosecutor for 4 years in Middlesex County, I saw the impact of guns and violence on individuals and families in our communities. 2 decades ago, I made my maiden speech on the floor of the legislature, arguing in favor of the assault weapons ban in 1997. I received a rare standing ovation from my maiden speech. I just want to be clear, that's just a joke. Everyone gets a standing ovation on their maiden speech, so let me just clarify that in case you actually print that, put that any place. But I will say this is sort of a joke. The very first one to stand for that ovation was Marty Walsh, who was with me, who started with me that year, a good friend and a longtime friend. But imagine, we did that in 1997. We addressed so many of these issues, and we're still so far behind. Since that time, gun violence and its impact on public safety and public health have remained priorities for me and our administration in the Middlesex Sheriff's Office and for sheriffs across the state. We've been addressing gun violence in all forms, including suicide by firearm. This is something that people tend to forget about. We think about gun violence, but we don't forget about suicide, which claimed approximately 22,000 lives in 2016. By the way, one of the advantages to the Massachusetts system is if they've got those few days that they need to be checked, they need to be cleared by their local police chief, that's a couple of days where they have a moment to get over the desperation, the depression that can drive them to that final act. And so often, when given that couple of days, they move on and they find the help that they need to continue their lives. 20 years later, I stand from that speech as a new role as Middlesex Sheriff, dedicated to working with my state, county, and local partners, several of whom are here today. But I also stand here as the father of 3 school-aged children who is troubled by this, who mourns for every child, every parent, every family impacted by gun violence. I don't want my children to be lucky that they weren't involved in a school shooting. I simply want them to be safe. I cannot imagine that day that, sadly, hundreds and hundreds of parents across this nation have had when it's a normal day, you're going about your life, it's a good day, and everything's good in your life, and you get that one phone call that tragically and horrifically changes your life forever, especially when your children are in a place where you knew they should be safe. I stand here urging, with Senator Markey, Congress to pass the Making Massachusetts Safe and Secure Act, the MASS Act, because we know even with our laws, individuals who purchase firearms in other states can bring them into Massachusetts. Commissioner Evans just mentioned this. This is a significant issue for us here in this state. You can have the greatest laws, but if the states around you do not have laws of the same level of security and safety, then ours don't mean quite as much. In fact, in 2015, firearms located in Massachusetts and those that were successfully traced by ATF, or Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, in 2016, only 444 were sourced back to Massachusetts, meaning that more than 700 of those weapons came from out of state. And the commissioner's right down that 95 corridor, a little bit north, further south, is where these weapons come in. The MASS Act is a common sense piece of legislation built on a proven and tested legal framework something that we in Massachusetts have proven works. It is based upon the idea that local authorities who know the kinds of interactions, positive, negative, and those involving underlying mental health issues their officers are having in those communities. Understanding they know the people within their communities, and they know the values of their communities as well. Police chiefs are the eyes and ears of communities best positioned to make determinations on suitability for firearms and licenses, but also that individuals should have their due process rights to appeal any denial, suspension, or revocation through the courts as well. I want to say thank you to Senator Markey for this leadership on this issue. Once again, taking an example that has been tried and true and has worked, and now trying to take it to the rest of the nation. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. Next, we're going to hear from John Rosenthal, the founder of Stop Handgun Violence.
Thank you. And Senator Markey, thank you so much for your leadership. Senator Markey is not new to this. In the late 90s, he spearheaded, filed legislation, and got a ban on Chinese-made assault weapons. There is no reason on this planet that anyone needs a military-style assault weapon, whether it's made in China or here in Springfield, Mass., like the weapon used at Parkland. That was a made in Massachusetts Smith & Wesson AR-15. The same weapon used in Aurora, Colorado to shoot 71, made in Massachusetts. So since 1994, when we started as a gun owner, when we started Stop Handgun Violence, the goal was to try and create a model for the rest of the nation. And what we do here in Massachusetts is we simply treat inherently dangerous firearms like inherently dangerous automobiles. Nothing more. Training, licensing, renewable licensing every 6 years, like an automobile, registration, and the only things we ban are military-style assault weapons, the common denominator in every mass shooting with a large-capacity ammunition magazine, and cheap-made Saturday Night Special handguns. I mean, what kind of country do we want to live in, and do we live in, when Congress says it's fine for anyone to buy a military-style assault weapon and a large-capacity ammunition magazine anywhere in this nation, cash and carry, in 33 states without an ID or background check, but we give our law enforcement officers, the people that we want to protect us, we give them 13 to 17 rounds in their military weapons, in their civilian weapons. So since the billboard went up on the Mass Pike in 1995, over 800,000 Americans have died from guns. Today, over 300 will be shot, and roughly 100 will die. Every 30 minutes, a kid under 20 years old is shot. Every 3 hours, a kid dies. In Massachusetts, we've reduced the rate of gun deaths by 40% since 1994, yet roughly 60 to 70% of guns used in crime in Massachusetts come from out of state. Imagine if Maine, New Hampshire, Vermont, Georgia, Florida, you name it, replicated our simple, common sense gun laws that make us safer, like every other consumer product. Yet, toy guns and teddy bears are regulated. That little red dot on the end of the barrel is a federal regulation, so law enforcement knows it's a toy. Yet no such regulations on real guns that will result in 300 shot and roughly 100 killed. So here in Massachusetts, we're the model. Senator Markey is just sort of taking a page out of, you name it, but look no further than automobiles and how car deaths have come down. We can do the same with guns. But it's going to take the majority of us being as passionate as the minority of the special interest gun lobby. And we are uniquely positioned because Massachusetts is an urban state with the lowest gun death rate in the nation. And if you saw Bloomberg News on Friday, guess what, folks? We also produce the most firearms in our state in the entire nation. Yet, when we did this in 1998, Smith & Wesson, one of the largest handgun makers in America, could comply with all of our gun laws. and our manufacturing standards. Today, 90% of Smith & Wesson weapons, including the weapon used at Parkland and Aurora, wouldn't comply. So they become a part of the problem versus the solution. The gun industry has a role to play to support law enforcement, and we should be very proud of what our elected officials and our law enforcement are doing, from Mayor Walsh here in the city to the governor who supports these gun laws, and our senator who is tireless, absolutely tireless, and has not given up. And in fact, is one of the most optimistic people I've ever met. And that's pretty tough, dealing with organized crime in Washington. So thank you so much, and go Massachusetts.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And next we're going to hear from Michael Kozu, from Project Right. Welcome.
4 years ago, Project Right hosted a community roundtable discussion with Senator Markey to discuss common sense legislation to combat gun violence and to fund federal gun violence research. We also work with many people behind me, including the mayor, the commissioner, the chief, on gun buyback programs in our neighborhood, on working with police and youth activities, on having police work with residents on solving issues within their community. We work with the sheriff on a variety of issues. We work with John Rosenthal, who was really instrumental in starting the push to have a Grove Hall Community Center. So there's a history of working together, and I believe that with the people behind me and the people that we all work with, that we can make a critical step in challenging the status quo of what's going on this issue. We come today to support Senator Markey's Mass Act as a vehicle to encourage other states to adopt stronger gun licensing standards. We in the community who experience the impact of gun violence are committed to working with Senator Markey taking specific action and making a difference. Enough is enough. Listen to the voices from Parkland, Las Vegas, Sandy Hook, and so many other communities, including right here in Boston. Now is not the time to wait. Both locally and nationally, we should learn from the best practices and share what works. What Senator Markey is proposing through the Mass Act is an important step in the right direction in addressing the crisis of gun violence that we face. Let's work together to look at effective gun laws and how we can decrease the flow of guns that are purchased in other states that have less restrictions that are coming into Massachusetts. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So, so this is the A team that we have here. The police chiefs tell me that the single most important reason why we have the lowest gun fatality rate, gun injury rate in the United States is that any individual has to go into the police chief in all 351 cities and towns to get permission to have a license to own a gun. That is the single greatest protection, because the chiefs know their cities and towns better than anyone else. They know who would be a danger if they had a gun in their home. That's why this is so important. It works here in Massachusetts, but to make Massachusetts fully safe, we need it to work across the whole country. That's why I have introduced this legislation. It will provide incentives to all 49 states to put the same kind of laws on the books that empower the chiefs to do their job across the entire nation. So let me stop there and answer any questions that you may have.
Senator,
Yes.
why shouldn't states have the right to decide what works best for them?
Well, in this legislation, we are providing $20 million a year for the next 5 years that will help to defray the cost for a city, a town, or a state across the country to do it. It's not a mandate, but it provides the financial incentive for those states to take up that responsibility. My own view, this should be a national law, like banning gun sales in gun shows or being able to purchase an Insta-gun on Instagram, which is still possible in our country. We should also have a standard by which every single chief in the country is empowered to determine whether or not someone can buy a gun. It should be a national standard. This is a step in that direction.
Senator, right after Sandy Hook, and this was, you referenced this, or some of the folks up there referenced this, nothing happened. We had Barack Obama in the White House then, and now Donald Trump is in the White House. Congress is controlled by Republicans. What makes you think this can be more than something symbolic? In other words, will you actually be able to get this done in Congress?
Well, in 1994, when we had a similar epidemic which was breaking out in our country, I was successful in putting on the books the ban of the importation of Chinese assault weapons at $80 a piece. That was 1 million Chinese assault weapons a year at $80 a piece that were absolutely populating every city and town across this country. I was successful in 94. That would be an additional 23 million assault weapons across this country if that law, that ban, was now not in place, and it is still in place. Unfortunately, domestically, the ban which was put on for the sale of guns produced here in the United States expired after 10 years in 2004. I think what we're seeing is a children's crusade across this country. I think what we're seeing is something that is very powerful, the voices of these young people. And I don't think it's going to go away. I think that Congress is going to have to deal with the reality that this year it's going to be a voting issue across our country. That gun safety is now something animated by the voices of young people who are going to demand that the Congress do something about it. So I think this takes us back to 1994. We saw a similar outcry that came from this country, and I think this year we're going to see real change take place, either in Congress now or at the polling booth in November. This is now a voting issue, and young people are not going to let it go away.
Senator, the reasons that states have for not passing this legislation or having stricter limits now, I think likely are similar to some of the same difficulties you have sort of at the federal level of passing these things. I'm wondering, would providing financial incentives to states actually make a difference? I mean, aren't the reasons that they have for not having these laws in place the same? Will it actually make a difference? Is the cost the problem?
Our goal is to take away the excuses that may exist across the country. The chiefs here are saying quite clearly that we can do everything in Massachusetts to make ourselves the safest, but we're not safe unless Maine and New Hampshire and Vermont are also adopting similar standards. That means their chiefs going into a situation where they interview anyone who wants to own a gun. I can't guarantee that it's going to be sufficient, but it takes away the excuse that it's going to cost money. And we all know that our chiefs don't believe this is an interference with the Second Amendment rights of people. It goes to their right to be able to protect their communities. And I think we're beginning today something that ultimately is going to be injected into the national debate, but at least into our regional debate of why other states don't adopt the same standards which our chiefs do.
Senator, do you see sort of a political roadblock of, Republican-controlled Congress accepting or at least passing a law that's obviously from Massachusetts, based in Massachusetts, where we have the strictest gun laws, Democratic control? I mean, politically, do you see roadblocks there if this bill is going to pass?
There's no question that Massachusetts usually goes first. We went first on gay marriage. We went first on universal health care. Those things are now the law of the land. 10 years ago, no one would have believed that was possible. So Massachusetts, once again, has set a standard. It's for gun safety. It works. The chiefs, the law enforcement leaders in our state want to see that as a standard for the communities, especially that abut our state, because they know where the guns come from that are used in the crimes that are committed in our state. So I think that what we did in Massachusetts on other issues was ultimately replicated. What we're doing here on crime fighting is also ultimately going to be modeled across the entire country. I don't have any question about it. You have to start somewhere. Today, we start this effort to have Massachusetts be the model once again for the rest of the country. Mr. Mayor, would you like to add anything?
Any questions?
No, we'll talk about it later.
Senator, can I ask you to speak a little bit more about what the expenses to states are and how this money would actually help them to provide, you know, this kind of control?
Well, we begin with $100 million over 5 years, which would be more than enough to defray the cost, especially in the early years, for communities to adopt a gun safety standard that is identical to that which we have in Massachusetts with the police chiefs doing the interviewing. And then if more funding is needed in the subsequent years, then we would, I think, based upon the model as it was working across the country, be able to find the funding for that as well. Although here in Massachusetts, there is no need for federal funding to do it. The chiefs here do it because it's common sense that they should know who has a license for a gun in their communities.
Sir, how did you arrive at the $20 million a year figure?
Well, we tried to pick a number which we felt would be reasonable for the first 5 years, and that's $20 million a year. But again, if it ramps up quickly after we're able to pass this legislation, which will happen at some point, then we could increase the amount of funding. Just understand, we're having a debate right now where the president once again had to back away from what he had promised in his meeting with the members of Congress. And that's because the NRA continues to hold the United States Congress in a vise-like grip. But I think the young people in our country are saying they want to make NRA stand for not relevant anymore in American politics. And I think we're much closer to that day than we were a month ago before Parkland.
Senator, do you have any co-sponsors, and what kind of support do you have for this among your colleagues in Washington?
We are just beginning here today, but I wanted to ensure that everyone knew that we have experts who support this effort. And these experts, I think, speak to the police chiefs across the country as well. And from that, we will get the support ultimately that we need to be successful.
And Senator, will you take this to President Trump directly? Are you trying to get a meeting with him, or where's your position with that?
Ultimately, obviously, it will require presidential leadership as well. I went to President Trump personally to gain his support for the fentanyl device, which can detect fentanyl through packaging, and the president signed my bill just last month to protect against that occurring. My goal will be to convince President Trump as well that this is just a common sense way of doing it, with the police chiefs exercising their right to protect the communities which they are sworn to protect.
Are there other aspects of the Massachusetts laws that would be included in this bill, or is it just the way guns are registered with the interface with police chiefs?
Well, it also requires for the licensing of gun dealers as well, so that we have that kind of additional protection which is in place. And so in both instances, licensing of individuals, licensing of gun dealers, Massachusetts has the toughest laws, and Massachusetts, obviously, as a result, has the lowest gun fatality, gun injury rate in the country. Thank you all so much.